Can you be racist to white people? Moreover, can non-whites be racist? In order to answer this question appropriately, I'm going to present a logical argument to determine why anti-white sentiment is not the answer to racism. On this video, I present a strong thesis against this concept while trying my very best to maintain analytical balance. This is, however, not only a structural analysis of the concept of racism, but by the end of this video essay, I will have formed an accurate conceptual model of the two competing definitions of racism, exposing also the socio-political strategic placement of anti-white sentiment for its proponents, and the dangerous weight of such ideology onto our current society. My goal here today is to challenge the increasingly common claim that racism against white people is definitionally impossible. In other words, I will demonstrate this to be a fundamentally flawed position in its linguistic premises and criteria. Furthermore, I will demonstrate that this is also an ultimately ineffective anti-racist praxis. My goal isn't to minimize the experiences minorities have with racism, but to promote genuine equality where all forms of racial discriminations are recognized, are visible, and appropriately addressed. That is because a society where everyone is treated equally is objectively superior to one where a single group, any group, in this case white people, is singled out, targeted, and racism against them is not only permitted but even encouraged through shallow and incoherent definitional loops. Now you might ask, but is it really a big deal that academic circles and political activists, tomato tomato these days, are trying to constantly justify racism against white people? Is it really a big deal? It is, and this is demonstrated by several clinical studies with overwhelming cumulative data with an already established body of epistemological evidence, which connects and links racism as a determinant of health. All of this being based on a comprehensive meta-analysis of the data in question. I'll put links. Thus, this new, rebranded form of racism, anti-white sentiment, is to be avoided at all costs and be treated just like any other forms of racism. Definitional loops do not change clinical test results. When we excuse racial hatred through what clearly are just semantic games, which is the too long didn't read assessment of this current socio-political phenomenon, we don't advance justice, we undermine it. And as we'll demonstrate with data later on, an equal society would not only be better for the population as a whole, but it would also generate optimal youth development outcomes for future generations, both in terms of stress management, mental health, and workforce success rate. It is unbelievable that I have to say this, but the reality is that real civic progress comes from applying our principles consistently and not selectively. It is realized through meritocracy, not racially based exclusive programs such as DEI and the like. And spending time debating which kind of racism we'll tolerate next is a step backward in global, societal, civic progress. A preliminary synthesis of the issue is to be built in the fields of semantics and social linguistics. One central area of dispute in the current racially charged political discourse is whether an act, policy, or event constitutes racism. This is extended to word choice, viewpoints, and other stances. I contend that the core of these debates involves competing definitions of racism. In other words, when we engage in these debates about what's racist and what's not, we use the same words, but we don't mean the same things. And, relevant of note, definitional ambiguity is a key component of mass perception manipulation for propagandistic systems. So, what is the correct way to define racism? Well, several claims and counterclaims will now be contextualized. Normally at this point I would use online dictionary resources to get the definition proper of the words we are discussing for mutual clarity. And don't get me wrong, we will. However, I do wish to warn you that upon further analysis, these very resources have been taken away from us as anti-white propagandists continue to spread their rhetoric through academic circles and the media. Dystopic, I know. That's what happens when institutions, including universities, agree with the propagandists and their message. They in fact function as vectors. As we speak, several major definitional modifications are being swiftly applied to reflect the new definitions that are being pushed. This is of course part of the strategy, as we will see on section 3, and we have to be cognizant about it. Anyhow, the original definition of the word racism as it's been understood since the beginning of time all the way up to 15 minutes ago is the following. In common parlance, we could say that racism is a specialized subcategory of prejudice based on race. Racism, in its fundamental core, is a way to attach an evaluative quality based on physical, visually observable biological differences between people. This usually means phenotypic traits. Now, for the purposes of this video, later on we'll also separate definitionally race from ethnicity, racial and ethnic. But for now, I want to add this to complete our definition. Whenever we look at how people and societies are formed, then ethnic and racial consciousness represents an incipient, embryonic process in the formation of individuals and group identity. This is a normal characteristic of our species, but it's also why attacking race and ethnicity is so effective in shaping our perceptions of entire groups within any given population cluster. In other words, there is nothing wrong in being preferential or accustomed or interested in your group first, or to be proud of your ethnicity. The problem only manifests itself when you use your pride to attack people that are different from you. Interestingly enough, in our current socio-political state, everyone except for white people not only can be proud of their ethnicity, race, culture, and religion, but they are encouraged to do so, except for white people and Christianity. That is because both ethnic and racial components can be used as a basis for discrimination in extreme ideologies, whether they be political, religious, or secular. Racism can manifest through all sorts of ways, from open threats and insults to complex phenomena deeply embedded in societal systems and structures. However, and this is a key point here, the latter is not required for the core definition of what it means to be racist, and that is the fundamental flaw of this entire position. They say that unless it's systemic, it's not racism. That's nonsense. Racism can be systemic, but it being systemic is not a necessary definitional component of the core concept of racism. To prove this, all we need to do is a thought experiment, so let's do just that. Take a National Socialist from 1940. He hates Jews, Roma, black people. We all agree this guy's a racist. Now, moving to modern-day Israel or Africa. He suddenly becomes a racial minority. His kind is not in power. His racial hatred is now definitely not systemic anymore, so does he suddenly stop being a racist? You see, the real, only possible answer when it comes to logics is no. He's still a racist. Why? Because racism is a state of mind. The systemic component is only one possible manifestation of a core concept, and you cannot replace the core concept with one of its manifestations just as a way to manipulate the public into excusing hatred towards a group, in this case, white people. That's all they're doing. Prove me wrong. Racism is in the mind, and it's present regardless of systemic implementation. Systemic only means that the system feeds into the ideology, as culture and then extends into power redistribution patterns. Now, given institutional and hierarchy-related racism is more effective than simple racist thoughts because the state is involved with it, and it makes use of differential power status dynamics between people. Yet this intersectional entanglement does not constitute the fabrics of racism as a concept of the mind. We all know this. Moreover, we can observe that racism is growing in our day and age, but not for the reasons you may think. Let me elaborate. According to Google Ngrams, the word racism first appeared in documented English usage during the early 1900s, and it was used to describe the interaction between early American colonies and Native American or indigenous populations. The word entered academic vocabulary relatively recently. However, what's important to underline is that all early usage of the term in English specifically deal with hostility between human groups stemming from observable physical distinctions. Absolutely no mention of systemic being a necessary requirement for the foundational definitional core. This is an addition, and it's been done on purpose to perpetrate injustice against white people out of hatred. So what I claim is that anti-white propagandists are doing the same thing that the Nazi were in Germany, just against a different group. Do you want to be remembered by history books as someone who opposed this? Our children, a couple of 100 years from now, will study this. How do you want to be remembered? Were you someone who stood up, just like we remember the people that stood up against the Nazis? Or are you going to be remembered as someone who played along and maybe even got brainwashed into thinking it was the right thing to do? I made my mind. I know where I want to stand. We talked about the initial origins of the concept of racism, as we said, fixed to physical characteristics and phenotypic features, whether they be actual or attributed. In other words, it is quite clear that the way we visually differentiate populations from one another is part of the in-group, out-group dynamic that has probably been with us since the Paleolithic. But contemporary understanding recognizes that racism is, in fact, multi-layered, and modern conceptual frameworks typically organize these differences into several interconnected definitional categories. It starts as biological and then it extends. And before we jump into the political and sociological aspects of this discussion, we need to talk about these categories. So racism could be considered a massive umbrella term which involves several related spheres of human life. As observed in this motion graphic, all these are sub-aspects of racism, but none of these is the basic definitional concept. They all spawn as a result of the one fundamental definitional core. Without this, none of the other would exist. Hence, this is the core, and these are derivatives. Unless they are connected to the original core of what racism is, they wouldn't exist. As we will explain in details on the next section, proponents of the "you can't be racist to white people" take the systemic subcategory and swap it for the definitional core. That's it. This way, even if you are clearly being racist towards white people, while systemic is not present, the two are contingent, and so you're not a racist, even if you are clearly demonstrating racist thought and actions against a singled out group, meaning white people. It's a simple slew of hand, but an effective one nonetheless, and it's dishonest. We are experiencing a change in reality of thought due to the reconfiguration of our base ideas and language in order to exert control. In contemporary academic discourse, particularly within the domains of critical race theory and intersectional sociology, a paradigmatic shift has emerged regarding the fundamental conceptualization of racism. This movement propounds a redefined concept of racism as an exclusively systemic phenomenon characterized by the formula of prejudice plus institutional power. This theoretical framework posits that racism, properly understood, can only emanate from demographically dominant groups who possess the requisite sociological capital to operationalize their biases through institutional mechanisms. As we explained before, this is just one of the possible ramifications of racism, not its core definition. However, this is a calculated move. The redefinition arguably functions as a rhetorical stratagem that obscures rather than illuminate the real core issues of racism. Moreover, this raises fundamental questions about the instrumentalization of academic discourse for ideological purposes, something that we have seen already happen under European historical totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. We need to prevent and of the 1940s Germany. And simply because it's white people now that are under fire makes zero difference. Racism is racism. The reason why racism plays such a pivotal role in modern politics is the way it connects to the sociological structure of power. Modern society strongly condemns and rejects racism and connects strong social stigma to being labeled a racist. This turns accusational racism functionally into powerful tools to be used to the discredit of your opponents, both in the political and rhetorical arenas. Anti-white sentiment is often also combined with white people have no culture, white people don't exist. How the proponents of white people don't exist can also blame white people for literally everything is beyond me. The proposed explanation is that white people are a societal construct of flawed arbitrary group classifier based on the fact that within this very group, white, we put together people of different cultural background with different cultures. White Europeans, an Englishman, a Frenchman, an Italian, a Scandinavian, a German, an American of European descent, what do they have in common? Nothing, so white people don't exist. That's the thesis. It is a tentative answer which can and will be responded in kind, in the following way. If, based on your own parameters of culture, diversity and national differentiation, white people don't exist, then neither do black people exist. In fact, putting all black people into one single group or category is more nonsensical than doing it with white people, and differently from you, I can prove this one through science. You see, African populations harbor the greatest genetic phenotypic diversity according to molecular genetics and whole genome sequence data across a broad geographic range. That's due to extensive population substructure, the largest number of population-specific alleles, and less linkage disequilibrium among the loci, together with the heritable variation in human genome. This is why, as he doesn't know because he doesn't actually care, Africa is an important region to study human genetic diversity due to several factors such as climate variation, diet, exposure to infectious disease, a number of demographic factors such as selection, mutation, recombination and gene conversion, which result in the above-mentioned genetic and phenotypic variation within population clusters. Moreover, Europe has got 44 countries according to the UN, whereas Africa has got 54. Add that to the considerable genetic, phenotypic, cultural and linguistic diversity within African populations, and then tell me again that you've got a problem with white as a subgroup population identifier, but not with black. This is what I call bias. Despite the overwhelming evidence of African population genetics, the pattern of genome-wide nuclear genetic diversity across geographically and ethnically diverse subgroups, and enormous cultural and linguistic divergence shows either a complete ignorance on the topic or a deliberate misuse. I'll take either. It shows an extreme bias and the sole objective of singling out a specific group, namely white people, for political reasons, in complete disregard of objective reality. Now that we understand, as if we didn't know, what racism is, let's discuss the manifestations of racism as a complex sociological phenomenon. There are various ways in which racism manifests itself in our societies at a global level. The phenomena that I'm about to describe are usually interconnected, at least at a certain level, although they can also occur independently from each other. These are, of course, supremacist ideology, xenophobia, construction of otherness, segregation, nativism, hierarchical stratification, and of course, systemic societal structural pressure. And they usually express themselves in two primary modes: covert or overt. A good example of this is, for instance, the fact that oftentimes when you look at the way racism is expressed on left-wing political spheres, it tends to be overt anti-white sentiment, which is a core value of the whole oppressor ideology. And due to the fact that this form of racism needs to be overt to work and function in this ideology, that's why they try to say that technically it's not racism. Interestingly enough, though, the systemic part of it, it's actually absolutely present, considering the fact that universities and academic circles and the media with all of its power do push it. It is systemic. So even if you use systemic as an excuse, it just falls apart. Instead, in alt-right circles, the racism tended to be more covert these days, with people pretending not to be racist while in reality they would be. That's mostly gone now, though, because everyone is being accused of being a racist, so people are just fed up with it and decided to accept the title. There are other categorical frameworks that have been pushed into the academic space, but some of these are completely irrelevant. One would be, for example, the idea of subliminal and reverse racism. Now, subliminal maybe we can discuss it, although then again, until we, in terms of priority, if we don't solve the covert, overt types of racism that we are dealing with, until that's solved, looking into the subliminal aspect feels like a waste of time. Maybe at one point. But when it comes to the notion of reverse racism, that is once again an excuse. It is not reverse racism just on the basis of oppressed oppressor, which is usually the excuse. In other words, reverse racism appears designed to delegitimize discrimination against numerically or politically dominant groups. Problem is that the people that say this never utilize this framework outside the United States or the West as a whole. Because if they did, and they try to apply this concept and say, well, white people who are a minority in another country, South Africa, well, racism against them now is not reverse, and in fact, if anything, reverse racism will be applied to people who are black in that situation. It just doesn't work, it falls apart, so they usually only use it against white people, once again demonstrating definitional inconsistency. Now that we have attacked the definition proper, we need to start studying the possible defense lines that will be used in order to attack our counter-arguments. And the first line you will encounter will be denial. What this means is that people will often try to debate whether or not this intolerance even exists. They'll tell you, no, white people never experience any forms of discrimination, it never happens, violence against white people, not a thing, doesn't exist. Refer them to the introductory clip of this video. You're welcome. But I will go one step further. All forms of racism are wrong. However, anti-white racism is the type of racism we need to focus on the most. Why, you say? Because it's the one that is permitted. It's the one that has no repercussions. It's the one that activists try to paint as not being a form of racism. Hence, it is the one we need to focus on the most, over every other. Institutional racism is a form of racism that, generally speaking, operates through rules, procedures, and practices that prevents any given population group to achieve full societal participation. Global data indicates that racism persists as a significant driver of exclusion, conflict, and disadvantage. When looked at a global level, the data becomes more murky and complicated to analyze because, of course, racism proper may overlap with anti-foreign sentiment, whereby exclusion or any form of discrimination could correlate not only to biological differences, but also, and in fact mostly, cultural ones. And to that, we need to add the socioeconomic layer, situations in which people may discriminate towards others, individuals of any given group, not necessarily once again because of phenotypic trait difference, but mostly because of socioeconomic stances and differences in numbers and statistics. And here is another thing that we need to address, massive elephant in the room. This idea that data can be racist is one of the most anti-scientific statements of our century. When given the chance or the need to look at data when it comes to, for instance, crime statistics and percentages of different groups within any population, as we analyze the data per capita, we need to be clear and transparent to what the data says. The idea that data needs to be hidden, changed, modified, parameters fumbled with in order to give different results because they do not push a certain preconceived message, or because people may think, oh, this could lead to more racism, is a lie. And lies never form or can form the basis of a just society. You cannot base justice on lies. And such manipulation of data can potentially distort empirical assessment, which could prevent us from finding real, true solutions. You have to understand the causation in order to work up a solution. The reality is the following. You can't be racist to white people, at its very core, is essentially a refutation of Reverend Martin Luther King's Jr. original thesis. Consequently, the definitional boundaries of racism became strategically significant in public discourse. But then they decided to change the definition of the term in order to make themselves unable to be classified as racist while being able to continue to qualify their opponents as racists. This is the very basis of the idea of anti-white sentiment not being categorized as racism. It has nothing to do with systemic, that's just the excuse. It is a tool for political control. I'm not arguing that racism is always identical in its impact and scale in all communities. What I'm arguing is that the so-called anti-racists these days are pushing a new, highly focused type of racism, specifically based on political strategic gain and the destruction of opposing voter bases. It is time to take a step back and attack racism, regain control of the definition of racism, reject and in fact call out every single academic that plays along with these deplorable, despicable manipulations of our language, and go back to judging individuals by their actions, not their race, by their deeds, not those of their ancestors. It shows that they're not truly anti-racist then, are they? The line that demarcates the distinction between mass perception and political strategy is the following. It has nothing whatsoever to do with humanitarian thought or social justice. You can't be racist to white people, as it's often the case. It's a definitional loop. It's an excuse and in fact a justification to try and ensure that racism can be directed at, in this case, white people, while dodging the term racist. Even if we played by their rules, their actions, rhetoric, discrimination, and violence against white people is still abhorrent and deplorable. So even if we accept that technically it's not racism, doesn't make it good, does it? But we don't accept their definition. We reject their definition. Anti-white sentiment is every bit as racist as anti-black, brown, Asian sentiment. Exactly the same. However, that's not going to be enough, because when presented with evidence, then they will tell you it doesn't matter. Why do you care? And try to twist it into, are you trying to say, and then add something against black people, for instance. Mental manipulation and gaslighting, as always. Last but not least, once they fail all of these defense mechanisms, the next one is going to be, yes, it is happening, and it's a good thing, here is why. Interestingly enough, one of the ways that will be used to try and deflect from this is the idea of, right, but in comparison, it may happen less to white people than it happens to other people to experience racism, and therefore, lower numbers, a minority of occurrence, means we shouldn't really care about it. It's not happening to the majority. This comes from the very people that constantly tell us how much we should care about minorities, unless those minorities are, of course, white people. Once again, racism in disguise, and we can see right through it. If the reason why we should not care about racial discrimination and hatred received by white people is a lower number of incidents, that would automatically mean that minority groups of all kinds and their struggle do not matter on the simple basis of numerical lower incidents. Are you really sure you want to use that one? Didn't think so. Opposing all forms of racial discrimination is the only way forward. Anything else is a step back. Centuries back, in fact. Anti-white sentiment is racism, and those who push it are racists. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.